Hello. I am so excited to be getting into applied behavior analysis and cues. And this is all about dog training. Specifically, this is these topics as they apply to dog training. I am not a psychologist. I do not have a degree in behavior science. I'm a dog trainer that's been doing this for about 15 years, and I've been teaching at the college level for the last uh, 5, 6 years. Um, so any corrections, any updates, any other research that we should link to here that's relevant to this conversation, please let me know. Please join our classroom discussions. You can sign up on Coffee to join our Discord and to join our weekly classroom style discussions where we can talk about some of this stuff in more detail. But this is incredibly important if we're talking about modifying dog behavior. We've got to understand our antecedent behavior consequence sequence. We've got to understand our cues. What is a cue? I talked about cues last time when we talked about prompting, so prompt versus cue. Prompt is what we're going to fade. It's how we kind of get to where we want to be. And the cue is the stimulus that makes a behavior happen every time. It's what we're going to keep long term. So generally speaking, we like verbal cues, we like sit down, stay, etc. However, if I have a deaf dog, I won't use verbal cues, obviously. So I might pick something else. I might pick a gestural cue, or I might have some sort of physical cue, like a vibrating collar, not an electric collar that's going to use stimulation to be aversive, but an electric collar that just vibrates as long as it's not uncomfortable for the dog or the dog doesn't, as long as the dog doesn't care about it. It's a neutral stimulus, right? We want the vibration or the e-collar, the stim, whatever. We want it to be a neutral stimulus that we then pair with look at me or something like that. So generally speaking, we're going after verbal cues. We can also use visual cues. We can also use environmental cues. As I approach the curb, I want you to sit, right? The curb is the cue. Approaching the curb is the cue to sit. We have plenty of times, plenty of behaviors, plenty of problems. People define problems when they've got essentially an accidental cue. The dog has learned that this predicts this every time, so this is going to cue this behavior every time. Here is the sequence. This you should memorize. If you're a dog trainer, if you want to be a dog trainer, you should memorize the sequence. Cue, prompt, behavior, consequence. Cue comes first. The cue predicts the prompt, which predicts the behavior, which predicts the consequence. You want to go in this order here. Now, I know that there's some discussion in dog training surrounding when we should present the cue, if we present the cue after the behavior, just before the behavior, kind of where do we present it? I have not seen, me personally, and please, I know how much the internet loves to tell people that they're wrong, so please tell me I'm wrong. If there is other ways to go about this that are backed by some sort of research or backed by some sort of governing body that is credible. But as far as I'm concerned, 9 times out of 10 or 99 times out of 100, we should be using this sequence: cue, prompt, behavior, consequence. We should be saying the cue before the behavior happens and then delivering the consequence after. Consequence definitely has to come after. We deliver consequence before the behavior, right? So cue, prompt, behavior, consequence. Say something, dog does it, they get a consequence. Here's our applied behavior analysis sequence, antecedent, behavior, consequence. So the cue and the prompt are both part of the antecedent. Antecedent, behavior, consequence. Antecedent is everything that came before the behavior. The behavior is I want to be super clear here that the behavior is like the outward expression. The behavior is what I can observe. The behavior is not what I thought the dog is thinking. The behavior is not how the dog was feeling. The behavior is what I can observe. And the consequence is what happened after. Remember, we talked about positive, negative, reinforcement, punishment. It's going to happen after, and it's going to determine whether or not that behavior is more likely or less likely to occur in the future. So let's break this down. We've got antecedents that came before the behavior. It is everything that comes before the behavior. When we are kind of mapping out our sequence here, we usually want to identify the immediate antecedents, so what came before the behavior right before it happened. Those tend to be our prompt and cue. We also want to consider previous events. So remember when we talked about the humane hierarchy, when I referenced the humane hierarchy, one of the things that we want to start by trying to modify is our antecedents. And those can be distant antecedents as well. So especially when we have cases of trigger stacking. So trigger stacking is, let's say I wake up in the morning to the sound of some wildlife getting into my trash cans, and it scares my dog. That's how my dog wakes up for the day. I clean all that up outside. I'm a little bit mad about around the house, and then the garbage collector comes, takes the trash cans. My dog's afraid of the garbage collector truck. It's a lot of big noise. Second thing that happened today that my dog doesn't like. Third thing that happens is that my friend, who my dog is still kind of unsure about, comes over to visit. My dog has this big response, this big reaction, this big behavior when they see my friend, when normally they don't. That could be the result of trigger stacking. There were so many things that led up to this, that seemingly little thing kind of set off this whole major reaction. So I want to be mindful of trigger stacking. I want to be mindful that multiple things can kind of add up throughout the day or potentially over a longer period of time, especially when we're talking about like shelter dogs. Some of those things over multiple days can kind of add up and then eventually result in a disproportionately large response to a stimulus. So it can be a bunch of little things that add up. It can be a bunch of big things that add up, but that is trigger stacking. It's a bunch of antecedents that contributed to, it's a bunch of antecedents that contributed to a big behavior. Now, important to note that behavior is always happening, right? I'm never looking at a dog not doing anything. They're not doing anything. The behavior is that they're sleeping. They're laying on their bed. They're looking out the window. Behavior is what I can observe. It's what the dog did. And it's really, really important, something I'm extremely passionate about, especially with a background in animal sheltering and working actively in animal sheltering. Behavior is what we can define objectively. Behavior needs to be defined objectively. What happened? What did the dog do? Not what did the dog not do. I don't want to define the behavior by what the dog didn't do. So, well, the dog didn't bite me. Okay, what did the dog do? The dog didn't settle down. What did the dog do? Were they spinning in circles? Were they jumping up on you? Were they licking your hands? Were they snapping towards your hands? Were they pulling in a star pattern? What did they do? Not what didn't they do? So what did the dog do in response to that antecedent? Examples of objective descriptions: the dog barked 5 times, the dog sniffed the ground, the dog ran away, the dog bit a human at a level 3. That slideshow is linked in the description of this video. That link will take you to Ian Dunbar's bite scale. It tends to be kind of the universal language that we have right now for dealing with, we're talking about bites. Not to say that that's perfect. There's plenty of really, really intelligent people working on how we might be able to get more information, go beyond just the bite scale, kind of keep going there. But as far as I know, that's all still kind of in process. The dog growled is also an objective description, right? The dog tried to bite me. That's not objective. That is your interpretation of what happened. The dog took 2 steps forward, growled, and snapped towards my hand. That's objective. So we want to define behavior objectively. No opinions, no interpretations quite yet. Define what the behavior was. And especially when we're creating these antecedent behavior consequence maps, we want to define that behavior by what the dog did. Consequence, what happened after the behavior. We've talked about this quite a bit. There's no need to go into this too much. The construct that we have kind of built for talking about consequences is that operant conditioning construct that B.F. Skinner first described. So what happened after the behavior? Did I add something? Did I remove something? Was it something the dog liked? Was it something the dog disliked? It's going to inform whether or not the behavior is likely to happen again in the future. There's that sequence again, antecedent behavior consequence. Commit this to memory and remember, as we dive into this a little bit more, we should always be looking to define that sequence. Or if we're modifying behavior, we should probably define that sequence. All right, we're gonna go back to that operant conditioning construct. And I talked in that presentation, when we talked about introduced positive reinforcement or reintroduced operant conditioning, I talked a little bit about that there's not kind of a good or bad about operant conditioning. Operant conditioning is not trying to define good or bad. But we often in dog training talk about operant condition, or we talk about positive reinforcement as if positive reinforcement is good and other things are bad. I want to dive into why that comes up, why we tend to talk about it in that way. And more importantly than that, I'd like to highlight why it's really, really important that we understand when we're creating a training plan, understand what is the antecedent, what's the behavior, what's the consequence. Because we're learning a lot more than just about that behavior, right? We're learning about the antecedent, we're learning about the environment, we're learning about the whole training situation. We're learning about a lot in that moment. So I'm going to present a series of scenarios. We're going to talk about this in generalities versus getting too specific. If you'd like to talk about specifics, again, we've got that classroom space to be able to talk about those specifics. Now, my antecedent has some sort of value, some sort of inherent value to the dog. So it's either good or bad or neutral. And I'm going to lump good and neutral in together for the purposes of this discussion. So my antecedent is the dog experience is either good or neutral. So let's talk about a neutral stimulus. Let's say there's a neutral stimulus that's presented to the dog or a pleasant stimulus that's introduced to the dog. The dog likes it or it's just ambivalent about it. It's something like this. Remember, this is used as a consequence, not as a antecedent. Let's say we have a pleasant or neutral stimulus and the dog offers me a behavior that I want, right? We're positively reinforcing. Reinforcement is increasing the frequency of a behavior. It's a behavior I, the human, have defined as good, desired. So I have good behavior in response to that pleasant or neutral stimulus. Well, this is positive reinforcement, so I'm going to add something to increase the frequency of that behavior that I want. So I give the dog a reward. Here's our sequence here. Here's our antecedent behavior consequence. We have a pleasant or neutral stimulus. I say sit. The dog kind of likes when I talk to them. They sit. I give them a reward. Now, we're always learning about more than just my behavior. We're also learning about stimuli, and this is especially true with younger dogs. But I don't want to imply that it applies less to adult dogs. Adult dogs absolutely are still learning about the environment, right? So what happens when the dog starts forming a connection between the stimulus and the consequence? Or what happens when the dog doesn't understand that their behavior is significant? Because that can happen, right? I am trying my best to teach this dog about the stimulus. I'm not always going to nail that 100% because I'm a human being, right? I can make mistakes. I've been doing this for 15 years, and there's still plenty of times where I'm like, oh man, mess that one up. I'm always trying to improve skill. As dog trainers, as educators, we are teaching another species how to respond to things. We're going to make mistakes sometimes. Okay, so I'm setting up a situation where I'm doing a positive reinforcement training setup. I've got a pleasant or neutral stimulus. The dog doesn't understand their behavior. I'm not quite precise enough with my behavior. My dog starts learning about the stimulus. What does the dog learn? If that pleasant or neutral stimulus learns that, generally speaking, I'm sorry, if the dog learns that pleasant or neutral stimulus predicts a reward, and we've got some classical conditioning happening there, what do we get? We get a stimulus that is pleasant. The dog likes it. So worst case scenario here, if the dog doesn't understand the behavior that I'm trying to get at, or if this sequence happens so quickly that the dog is quickly forming an association between that stimulus and the reward, or if the dog is just learning, worst case scenario here, my dog learns that the stimulus is kind of cool. Okay. Let's say I have something the dog does not like. Remember, this is always happening. This is always happening. This learning is always happening. I want to be really clear about that. There are some really intelligent scientists out there that talk about behavior science, and we start getting into kind of an interesting discussion about whether operant versus classical is really a versus situation. Because behavior is always present, right? I can't ever say that the behavior is not present because the only thing that's not giving me behavior is a dead organism. So as long as this animal is alive, we're always presenting behavior. So any classical conditioning setup is still going to have a behavior in there. Now, it might not be relevant. I might just be rewarding in response. Like, I don't really care. I don't care about the behavior. But there's always a behavior in there. So because we know that we can classically condition stimulus to predict a reward or stimulus to predict a punisher or a reinforcer or something I like or don't like, however you want to phrase that, because I know that that connection can be made. I want to be mindful about what I'm doing in my training setups. Okay, we have an aversive stimulus. So we ran through the example with a pleasant or neutral stimulus, good behavior. Again, we've got a good behavior and a reward because we are positively reinforcing. This is behavior I define as good. That's why I'm reinforcing it. Got that aversive stimulus. What happens if the dog starts learning that that scary thing predicts a reward, predicts something I like? What's going to happen is the dog is going to start thinking that that scary thing is not really as scary as they thought. Potentially. All of this is an art, right? This is all based on that animal in front of you. There's no guarantee that anything is going to happen because this is behavior. So we talk about positive reinforcement as being our first line of defense, or being we want to try positive reinforcement whenever possible. We want to use positive reinforcement whenever possible. We want to mindfully set up our training scenarios to be using positive reinforcement as much as possible, because the worst case scenario of it is that the dog learns that things are kind of cool. That's my risk. Now, I need to be mindful of that risk because there are some things that I might not want my dog to think are cool. I don't want my dog to think that moving cars are cool, generally speaking. I don't want them to think that moving cars are cool. Or if they do, I want to be more mindful about the other things that are present in that environment, right? My dog learns that cars are kind of cool, but they're cool to watch. I want to be really specific about behavior there. I also don't want a dog on like a ranch to think that running around behind horses is cool, right? I don't want to reward my dog for running around behind horses because that can get you very seriously hurt or killed. Same thing goes for chasing moving cars. So I want to be mindful in my setups that maybe I don't want to associate the stimulus with too much reward and teach the dog that it is really interesting or is really cool. So there's a risk there. There's a risk to any training setup, regardless of which quadrant we're using, which of the reinforcement, positive or negative reinforcement punishment, regardless of what we're using. There's always some level of risk, or there's always some risk of unintended learning happening. My job as the trainer is to try to minimize that as much as possible. So that's why we tend to say positive reinforcement is our preferred method of training. But that's why trainers that do that tend to say that. Let's get into the rest of these, though, because it's not as if the other things aren't happening. There are plenty of things in life that are uncomfortable. There are plenty of things in life that I don't like. And there's some things that I'm never going to convince my dog that they do like. So let's get into these other situations. And some of these things happen without me setting them up, right? There's some situations that come up that my dog gets positively punished for something. My dog goes and chases a porcupine and they get a face full of needles. Well, that was positively punished, right? Things happen, life happens. But I want to be mindful of what my dog is potentially learning about that. All right, let's say we have a pleasant or neutral stimulus. We're looking at negative reinforcement, using negative reinforcement as a training strategy here. Now, in order for me to use negative reinforcement, I need something that the dog does not like so that I can remove it. And if I'm saying that my cue, my stimulus that I want to predict this behavior, is pleasant or neutral, I have to follow that up with something the dog does not like. So I present a pleasant or neutral stimulus, and then I present an aversive stimulus. My dog gives me good behavior because that's what we're doing in reinforcement. We're looking at good behavior. We're increasing the frequency of that behavior. I remove that aversive stimulus. That's negative reinforcement. Aversive stimulus is present. You give me the behavior I want. I stop. This is often used you'll hear it called pressure and release training. A lot of e-collar training uses the same concept. The aversive stimulus, the thing you don't like, is e-collar. And I want to be really clear here that if the dog feels that it's neutral, the dog feels it's just information, the dog's not going to want it to be removed. The e-collar, the pressure on the collar, any of that has to be perceived as aversive. I have to not like it because that's going to motivate me to make it stop. So I have a pleasant or neutral cue, stimulus, cue. I apply an aversive prompt. I get good behavior and I remove the aversive stimulus. Now, the problem that we can face here, that we can face, not guaranteed, the problem that we can face here is that my dog might form an association between those first two things, where their behavior was irrelevant. Their behavior between the neutral stimulus and the aversive stimulus, during that time, their behavior was irrelevant. What I might have my dog learn is that that thing that I thought was kind of cool or kind of neutral actually predicts something I don't like. And I'm going to stop liking that stimulus. Now, if I'm doing this for basic obedience, like sit down, stay, my dog might start not enjoying our training sessions. Again, all dependent on the dog, all dependent on the details of the training setup and how we presented this. I have to be mindful of that when I set up these situations. When I set up my training sessions, I have to be mindful if I'm using negative reinforcement, if my plan is to present a neutral or pleasant stimulus, then present an aversive stimulus, I have to be ready for that original stimulus, that a pleasant or neutral stimulus, to potentially become aversive to the dog. Not guaranteed that it's going to happen, but I have to be ready for it if it is. Okay. Let's say we have an aversive stimulus. Something is already present the dog does not like. They offer me good behavior, and I remove that aversive stimulus. Well, that's how stimuli exist. Stimuli exist. They are here, and then they're not. Right? The aversive stimulus is present, and then it goes away. Well, there's a pretty good chance the dog is going to learn that the behavior is relevant there. Or if they don't, I've just presented an aversive stimulus, then removed it. Now, as a Lima trainer, least intrusive, minimally aversive, I want to present that stimulus, that aversive stimulus, at the lowest level possible, right? If I know that it's going to be aversive, I want to present it as least aversively as possible. But I've got a pretty good chance here that the dog's going to see the significance of their behavior, or if I'm setting up my training scenario correctly, I'm not risking that dog learning anything new or worse about that aversive stimulus. So stimuli come and stimuli go. Now we talk about this when we're talking about cat and lat, or we're talking about like leash reactivity training, or when we're talking about fear of people. Leash reactivity, the dog's barking at other dogs. The dog's perceiving the other dog as aversive. I don't like that the other dog is here. Don't like that I can see the other dog. Well, that's already present, right? In my training setup, it has to be present. Present it in a way that's least aversive, minimally aversive, but it has to be present. When I get good behavior, I remove it. It's the foundation of a lot of training here. And I don't want to present it as this full, I don't want to flood, right? We'll talk about flooding a little bit later, but we don't want to flood. It's going to cause more problems than it solves. And it's also not going to help with my counter conditioning desensitization procedure at all. So please don't take this out of context. But if the stimulus is already aversive, I might be able to use negative reinforcement because I'm already presenting and removing that stimulus. I'm just adding the dog's behavior into that. Okay, next one up, negative punishment. We've got a pleasant or neutral stimulus. I've got a bad behavior. I remove the pleasant stimulus. Got something the dog likes happening. The dog offers me bad behavior. I want to punish it. I remove that pleasant stimulus. What does the dog learn? Good things come and good things go. Kind of same conversation we were just having about negative reinforcement when the stimulus is aversive. Same kind of thing. I might use negative punishment. I might, I don't want to say move quicker to negative punishment, but my risk is lower of unintended learning happening if I've got a pleasant stimulus that predicts bad behavior. What if I have an aversive stimulus? Well, if I have an aversive stimulus, I've got to have something good to take away, right? So I have an aversive stimulus. I start applying a pleasant stimulus. I get bad behavior. I remove that pleasant stimulus. What happens up at the top there? That aversive stimulus, regardless of your behavior, predicts a pleasant stimulus. Over time, the dog's going to potentially, the dog might start associating that aversive stimulus with the pleasant stimulus that it's predicting. So the previously aversive stimulus, the thing that my dog thought they didn't like, becomes a little bit less aversive. Negative punishment. So again, there's no value to any of these. There's no, this one's better than this one because every context is different. What I want to stress here is that when we map out antecedent behavior consequence, when I look at that consequence and I decide which of these categories is falling into, I want to have a quick judgment call on whether or not that might trigger some learning that I don't necessarily want. That's what I really want to drive home here. Not necessarily that one is good and one is bad. One quadrant is good or whatever. It's not that one of these is bad, one of these is good. And I say that going into positive punishment here because 9 times out of 10, the trainer that you talk to is going to use positive punishment as an absolute last resort. Any of us using the humane hierarchy or adhering to the humane hierarchy is going to avoid positive punishment whenever possible. If you've already started, your brain's already going a little bit quicker than I'm presenting this, you're probably already figuring out what's going to happen here. If I have a pleasant or neutral stimulus that cues bad behavior or prompts bad behavior, and I apply an aversive, well, I might poison that original stimulus. The dog might learn that that pleasant or neutral thing is actually scarier than I thought it was, and it gets worse. Likewise, over here, if I have an aversive stimulus that comes before that behavior and I apply an aversive, my dog might learn that that thing is scarier than I thought it was. This comes up when we do like punishment-based training for, let's say, somebody coming up to my front door. So like the mail carrier. Mail carrier comes up to the door. My dog barks. If they've got a bark collar on. Well, the mail carrier used to come up, knock on my door, and leave something there. It could be potentially dangerous. I have no idea. I'm a dog in the house. But now, when the mailman comes up, I do the same thing that I've been doing the entire time. But now, I get shocked. And I don't like that, right? We're trying to positively punish. We're trying to add the shock to decrease the behavior. We are positively punishing that behavior. I am risking, in that situation, I am risking the dog learning that that person is scarier than I thought they were. And even if I get suppression of the behavior, even in these situations where I get suppression of the behavior, I have to be mindful of what the dog knows about that stimulus. Maybe my dog stops barking at the mail carrier, but now they back up and they growl. Well, what's going to happen one day when I perceive that my dog doesn't care about the mail carrier anymore because he's not barking anymore? I leave the front door open on accident one day and the mail carrier goes by. Well, my dog might have learned that that mail carrier is scarier than they thought they were. And so now they're walking up to my house, the door's open, they might come in. And I'm going to go tell them off. This does happen. This happens often enough that I've got to bring this up and talk about this. And a lot of times, I have to be honest here, a lot of times trainers don't see it because the dog winds up in the shelter and the owner doesn't contact them again. Or the owner comes up with a different reason why they surrender the dog to the shelter because they feel guilty, like they didn't do training correctly. Because a lot of the times when we're recommending positive punishment, we emphasize how timing is really important, how the handler skill level is really important in this, and they might not want to admit that they couldn't get the timing right. So these dogs will wind up in animal shelters, and then it's the animal shelter's job to try to figure out how to undo this. It's the behavior staff's job to figure out how to undo this, which it can be a lot of work depending on the context. Sometimes I just change the environment and it's fine. Again, going back to that humane hierarchy, sometimes I just change the environment and things are fine, but other times we've got a lot to work through and sometimes we can't work through it. There are plenty of dogs that come through trainers programs that end up being euthanized or end up going to animal shelters and then being euthanized or animal shelters and then rehomed that the trainer has no idea about. We have to stay mindful of that. All right, going back to really key takeaway here, a couple of key takeaways here. One of the big ones, cue, prompt, behavior, consequence. I present those things as the antecedent. My cue comes before the behavior. I don't wait for my dog to sit, then say sit, then give a treat. The dog might not form that association as clearly. That sit means sit for a treat. Let's talk about a couple of key terms real quick as we're talking about cues and as we're talking about kind of the whole situation here, the learning situation here. Let's talk about generalization. So generalization is incredibly important. Just because you know something in the house doesn't mean that you know it outside. The rule is that when I say sit inside on the rug, you sit and you get a cookie. I don't necessarily know that the same thing happens outside. And a lot of times what accidentally happens is that the handler does a bunch of training inside, they move outside, and they're like, my dog knows it so well that I'm not going to reward outside. Well, that behavior is going to go away real quick outside because I've never presented any sort of motivation to do it when we're outside. So generalization is learning that this cue this cue predicts reinforcement in multiple contexts. We want to slowly build when we generalize. We want to slowly build. We introduce one new thing whenever possible. We introduce one new thing about this picture that we're creating. Introduce one new thing at a time. The things we talk about, you'll hear this a lot in dog training: distance, duration, distraction. Can my dog sit when I'm 2 feet away? Can my dog sit when I'm 10 feet away? My dog is standing at the opposite end of a football field and I yell, sit. Will the dog sit? Will they hold that sit? Will they hold that down? And will they do that while there's a bunch of chickens running around on the football field? If so, I've very successfully generalized that behavior. But in order to do that, I don't go straight from my living room to the football field with chickens. I introduce living room, then outside, then football field, then distance, then lower level distraction than chickens unless your dog doesn't care about chickens in the first place. I introduce each of those things strategically and kind of one at a time to generalize that behavior. Last one here is discrimination. This is ensuring the cue is known and understood. And this is when I'm working with trainers, we talk about this a lot. We talk about, well, the dog's not doing it when I say it. If the dog is not doing something when you say it, they don't know it, or they don't know why they should do it. 2 reasons that a dog does not perform a behavior on cue. This is my personal bias, by the way. I'm not citing anything here that I'm aware of. I could be saying something somebody's already said, but I'm not specifically citing anything here. If a dog doesn't perform a behavior on cue, my personal bias, I'm gonna look at the situation and say they either don't know what you're talking about, we haven't generalized that, or we haven't set up our training scenario to clearly teach what the cue is, or they're not sufficiently motivated. Either I have not given a rate of reinforcement that's high enough to maintain the behavior, or I haven't moved from a constant rate of reinforcement to a variable rate of reinforcement to an intermittent schedule of reinforcement, rate of reinforcement. So they might lack motivation, or they might have competing motivations. You've asked me to sit, but there's a puddle. I don't want to sit in the puddle more than I want that piece of kibble you're offering. Right? Maybe my dog would sit in the puddle if I offered something really, really high value. Likewise, we get into this with recall a lot. I tell my dog, come. Nowhere. Nothing. Because everything out there is so much more exciting than me. I have not proven to my dog that I am more exciting, I'm more worth it to come back to than that out there. I have not provided sufficient motivation to come back to me. Or they just don't know it. My dog is not born knowing any commands. Even dogs with service dog lines that have been bred for longer than I've been alive, the lines have been going for longer than I've been alive, even those dogs are not born understanding cues. We still have to teach them what these words mean. Really critical one here. From now on, moving forward, a lot of the lectures are going to have a lot more of my personal opinions in them, a lot more of my personal dog training philosophy. Again, I try to keep things unbiased as possible, but we are going to start getting into some really fun stuff, talking about dog emotions and how we can respond to those emotions. And we're going to get a lot deeper into behavior modification. versus training itself. So can't wait to talk about these with you. Please sign up for the coffee. Please sign up for a supporter account on coffee and join our classes. I would love to talk about all this stuff with you.